welcome. This is the 6.5 handout or week of content, and it's about phonology as a generative system, or phonology as a function, and it's sort of a transition from the very phonetic-y part of the class that we started out in to the more, grammatical part of the class that's coming afterwards, that's more abstract and is about implicit knowledge of sound systems. And so this is actually a super important architectural point that will shape the way we approach everything else in the semester. So it's worth paying attention to this and trying seriously to understand it, because it's some sort of tricky and subtle reasoning, but it ends up having a huge effect on the way that we think about sound systems and try to analyze them. And so what I'm going to try to argue for today is that the implicit knowledge that a speaker possesses of the sounds in their language, that is their phonology or their phonological grammar, that this isn't just a collection of words that exist in their language. Right? It's not just about what's in the lexicon. Right? We have words like this, but we don't have words like this. It's actually a system of implicit knowledge that is generative and productive in the sense that this system of implicit knowledge can be brought to bear and is brought to bear all the time on novel items, novel words, novel stimuli. And it's really a systematic way of imposing the structure of one's language onto a potentially infinite variety of novel linguistic stimuli, right? So it's making the case that phonology really is a system of grammatical knowledge about sounds per se, and not just a collection of facts about what happens to exist in one's lexicon. So in order to see this, we're going to start with, well, what we've done so far and thinking about lexical entries, and see what would happen if we did think that your knowledge of your sound systems was just about what kinds of words exist, right? So the overarching theory of phonology we have so far says that we have a bunch of lexical items stored in our long-term memory, and they consist of sequences of feature matrices with distinctive features encoding all of the contrastive sounds in our language, right? And so the example from last time was a word like carry, and we use these slash brackets for underlying representations in the lexicon, and we can abbreviate this using RIPA symbols, carry, but really what we think is inside here is a sequence of feature matrices, and I'm not going to do every matrix and every feature here because it would take a super long time, but the basic idea is that for each one of these symbols, what we're actually talking about is a bundle of phonological features. So this one would be minus voice, minus continuant, plus dorsal, plus consonantal, and so on and so forth. Lots and lots of other features here. It's a voiceless velar stop, right? But really what that means is that it's this bundle of features, and then this a vowel is going to be another bundle of features, plus syllabic, plus low, minus high, minus back, minus tense, minus round, and so forth, right? And so each one of these matrices is going to be filled up with all of the features that are active in English, and it's going to be specified for each one of those features, and this is what we store in our long-term memory. And so when we find ourselves needing to pronounce the word carry, or to recognize the word carry when it's spoken, we sort of match the features with either a way of saying the sound or with a way of matching what we're hearing. And eventually we get to access this lexical entry, which has this sound field, and then some representation for the meaning of the verb carry, which, I mean, who knows what that representation is like, but it means something, right? And so that's going to be what's in the lexicon, this phonological form, the underlying representation, as well as some meaning-based information. And yeah, this is where we're starting with phonology now. So if we're wanting to know how the word carry is going to be pronounced, we're going to look it up in the lexicon, we're going to find all these features, and we're going to implement them by moving our articulators and pronounce something like carry. Right? There you go. So the simplest possible theory, right, of why English has words that look like carry, but not a bunch of other words you could imagine that might sound like Spanish or Russian or Mandarin words, is because, well, English lexical entries look like this. They use these features, and they don't use the features that are active in, you know, Russian or Spanish or Mandarin. And similarly for every other language in the world, it has its characteristic collection of lexical items. They have these features, and they don't have the other features. And that's why we see sound patterns when we look in a language. Right? So I'm going to argue that this isn't right, and here's my attempt to demonstrate. Well, it's the first attempt. There's going to be months of material here, but the first attempt to show this isn't right goes as follows. Right? So the question here in the handout is, if we don't find some kinds of sounds or some kinds of sequences of sounds, then it's because they happen not to exist in the lexicon, right? There just doesn't happen to be a lexical entry that looks like toff, right, in English. This can't be right. So here's the first way we know this. So here's an example. When you are using and speaking and listening to your language day in and day out, you're actually picking up new words all the time. Right? This happens pretty frequently. There's new words being coined all the time. You have no trouble doing this. So imagine some situations with new words here, where you're in conversation and somebody says that they just saw a pleek. A pleek is a small rectangular object that's used to press dough, right? And, you didn't know that word, but now you do, and so you're happy to accept that, yes, this little square thing is a pleek. No problem, right? In real life, this happens not to be a word of English, but we'd have no trouble accepting that as a word of English. We'd have no trouble learning it as a new word of English tomorrow, right? Maybe it's a term somebody made up on the internet, or, maybe it's an object we've never heard of. Maybe it's a sort of old-fashioned word that people don't use much anymore. But we hear and learn and accept new words all the time in our language. This is something that's going on, on an ongoing basis, right? So pleek is no problem. And here's another example. We happen not to have a word for this small rodent that's indigenous to West Virginia, a coop. But maybe if somebody's looking out the window and they're like, oh gosh, did you see that? A coop just ran across the street. And, you're going to accept that as a word of English, right? Maybe not. Here's another example. Somebody's talking to you about the history of writing in the United States, and they're like, there was a form of cursive that was popular in the 19th century. It's called pnock. And, it just popped into the conversation. You're like, well, now I just learned a new word of English, right? Maybe not. All right. So what would happen in these situations? The first one, which has an adjective stop, ka, or coop, right? You might not understand that as being even like a normal phonological word at all. You might think that it's like an expressive term where somebody's trying to express some sort of sentiment, right? But certainly that's not what an English word sounds like. For pnock, you'd probably assume that it's a foreign name that came from some other language that somebody's basically pronouncing in a foreign language, because that certainly is not English. So the sort of question here is, well, what if these words popped up in English sentences? You just accept all of them, right? Even though they happen not to exist. And I think the answer is a pretty clear no here. Right? Why is that? Well, this is a super important property. It's kind of obvious, but it ends up being really important. Right? The non-existence of some words in a particular language is accidental, while the non-existence of other words is completely systematic. Right? So the claim here is that the non-existence of pleek is an accident. Right? There's nothing systematic about that at all. If there happened to have been some small rodent at some point somewhere where English was spoken, and it had been called a pleek, then that would be the name of the rodent in English. It would be pleek, right? Nobody has any trouble with that as an English word. We happen to live in a reality in which no such animal was ever described with those particular sounds, but that's an accident of history. That has nothing to do with the language. Versus coop, that is a non-existing word of English that could not, in principle, exist in English. Right? So what would happen if there had been some animal that English speakers had come in contact with that was called coop in, say, another language or something like that? Well, we don't exactly have a theory of that yet. We'll get there in a couple weeks. But whatever happens to words like that, they don't get pronounced like coop in English. Right? There are no such words, and there can't be any such words. Nobody's going to accept that as a word of English, and that's because English doesn't have ejectives. There are no ejective consonants in English. Similarly here with pnak, right? We just don't have stopped nasal sequences at the beginning of a word. Now, Russian does. Right? So there's a Russian novel about a guy named Pnin, right? And that doesn't seem to be any problem in Russian, although maybe it's a kind of funny name. But, you know, English doesn't work that way, right? So what happens when you see that guy's name in the Nabokov novel in Russian? Well, maybe you try to pronounce it in a foreign way, like Pnin, or maybe you make it sound more like an English word. There's a variety of things you can do with a word that doesn't conform to your language. We're going to find out about that in a week or so. But certainly no word that starts with a pna sequence can be a word of English. We can also see this historically because we have words with Greek origins that actually do start with a pna sequence. And in English, the p is just deleted, right? So the spelling gives us a clue that words like pneumatic for a tire or something like that used to be pronounced pna, and this is coming, I presume, from ancient Greek, because I don't think modern Greek allows this either. Right? But that's not how it's pronounced in English because we don't have stopped nasal sequences at the beginnings of words. Interestingly, you know, other languages that are closely related to English, at least historically, like French, do accept these sequences. So a tire in French is a pneu, or I'm probably pronouncing that slightly wrong, but that's the basic idea, right? So again, the absence of pleek in English is a historical accident. Right? It's just that, you know, no object called a pleek happens to have ever arisen in the history of the English language, as far as I know, but it very easily could have. And it's just a coincidence that it happened not to. It's a contingent fact about history in the world. Right? Whereas the absence of koop and pnak, right? The absence of those words from English is not an accident of history. That is a systematic fact about the language itself. It's not contingent on what happened or didn't happen in the last 500 years. It's a systematic fact about the language itself, that there can't be words like this. So here is maybe the central hypothesis that we're going to need for the rest of the class. Gaps in the lexicon are accidental. Right? So the fact that pleek doesn't exist in English has to do with exactly what we started with. That, yeah, some lexical items exist and other ones don't. Right? That's going to be able to explain why we don't have pleek in English. It's a coincidence. It happens to not be there. Versus koop in pnak, the absence of missing sound sequences and missing sounds, systematic facts about sound structure, are not encoded in the lexicon. They have to be part of a separate grammar, where a grammar is a system of implicit knowledge that can be actively applied, productively applied to new stimuli, new words, new sound sequences, whatever. So this is a big distinction. We need to have something in our theory that allows us to explain the difference between pleek and koop. This is the hypothesis we're going to go with. The accidental gaps in the lexicon are just that. They're accidental gaps. There happens to not be a lexical item with the sound sequence pleek in English. But systematic gaps, no ejectives, no word initial stop nasal sequences, those are not accidental gaps in the lexicon. Those are part of our system of grammatical knowledge. Right? In other words, another way of putting this is that any sequence of sounds is a possible lexical entry, but some of those lexical entries are ruled out by the phonology of a language, by the system of implicit knowledge that a speaker of a language has. Right? So this is a super important point. Right? It might seem very simple and trivial, but it ends up being really important because this is why we think that speakers need to have an entire system of implicit knowledge about the sound structure of their language. Right? It can't just be about which words you happen to have memorized and not memorized. That doesn't seem to allow us to explain the full range of facts about lexical items or sound sequences in a language, we need to actually have an active system of grammatical generalizations that allows us to characterize the difference between occurring, non-occurring accidental, and non-occurring systematically kinds of sound sequences. Now we're going to approach that system of implicit knowledge in this class as a kind of function. What does that mean? Well, it's going to be a function that can take as an input any potential word in English, which is essentially any sequence of sounds, right? We need to explain not only why some sequences of sounds are good English words, but also why other sequences of sounds are not. Right? And the kinds of sequences of sounds that we're capable of rejecting from English includes basically everything that's possible in the world. Right? So this is going to be a pretty complex kind of implicit knowledge. It's going to have to be a system of knowledge, a function that maps from any conceivable set of phonological features, in essence, onto only words that are allowed to exist in English, or only sequences of sounds that are allowed to exist in English. So this is quite a substantial bit of grammatical knowledge. And it's not just about memorizing lexical entries. It has to be about generalizing and forming generalizations and patterns and constraints over sequences of sounds.